Good evening, everyone, and welcome to another session of the Live Black Experience. I am excited to be speaking with a wonderful panel of return guests for another kitchen table talk. We have so many issues to talk about tonight, from students holding slave auctions to mistreatment of Haitians seeking asylum at the border, to the most recent in the Rittenhouse case, the judge declaring that the victims cannot be called victims, but can be referred to as rioters or terrorists and other very confusing terms when you're speaking about people who were murdered. So we are going to dive in, and it's going to be open conversation. We're going to keep the conversation moving through each topic with anyone and everyone able to bring questions. We, of course, as always, invite our audience. If you have questions about any of the topics, share them in the chat so we can ask them and address them as part of our conversation. But right now, I would like to get us started by having each person just introduce themselves. So Dr. Allen, I'll turn it to you.
Hello, my name is Dr. Tria Allen. I am at the University of Arizona and Pima Community College. So great to be here with you again.
Thank you. Ms. Dickinson.
Hi, my name is Kiana Dickinson. I'm the political director for the Arizona Democratic Party.
Dr. Hart.
Good evening. Hi, I'm Dr. Ann Hart. I am a retired Deputy Associate Superintendent for Arizona Department of Education and am a consultant for the Heart of Education, LLC.
Dr. Moore.
Good evening. I am Dr. Tracy A. Moore, Chair of the Dental Hygiene Department here at Northern Arizona University in Flagstaff, Arizona.
And Dr. Peaton.
Hi, good evening, everyone. I'm Dr. Jeray Peaton, retired. I'm a former state representative for Legislative District 4, and currently I am the chair for Legislative District 4. I'm a longtime educator, and I retired as a school superintendent.
All right, well, thank you all for joining us tonight, and let's just dive in. We have a lot to talk about. Let's start with there are two recent incidents, one in April of this year, where Texas students held a slave auction using Black student yearbook photos to auction off their classmates. In September, the most recent incident, there was an Oregon school where students created a virtual slave trade using Black classmates' photos and made bids on them in this virtual auction. I think this conversation is a very timely one, especially given other conversations about the attempts to keep critical race theory out of school, if that's even actually what's being attempted to be kept out. The conversation about removing Beloved from school curriculums because of its traumatic effects on students, meaning in the particular case that's being talked about, it was one student whose mother decided or declared that her son was traumatized by reading this in school, not sharing that he was 17 at the time, and that this was her assessment of his involvement, and now they're looking at banning that among other books from school curriculums. So this is a very timely conversation, and I think it drives at some of the issues that are going on in our school system. So let's dive into it. What say any of you on the slave auctions and what's happening in our schools right now?
So I'm going to start because I am infuriated. I was infuriated when I heard about this, and every violation took place in terms of due process for students' rights and parental information for parents to be informed. Number one, the school violated every policy, every procedure, every guideline before they had this slave auction, which it should have never had occurred to begin with. There should have been some overview, some literature, and some objectives that would state why and the methodology to be used, if it was based on a curriculum or anything fundamental that was related to something historical or by way of the curriculum. Parents should have been able to be notified of in advance, due process. They should have been able to sign permission slips for their children to participate, number two. And number one, even before it got to the parents, it should have gone presented to the governing board for approval. The superintendent of school should have been notified. The school principal should have done that. It should have gone for governing board approval, and it should have been discussion, a hearing, and parental consent should have been utilized, because I'm sure there wouldn't have happened and occurred, first of all. And so there were so many violations and that the school utilized, and whoever enacted this, the policy, without going through proper protocol, in my opinion, the teacher or the principal or the superintendent, knowingly or unknowingly, they need to be called on the carpet. This was in total violation, because there were students that would not have wanted to participate, and there were parents that would not have wanted their students to participate. Number two, to be doing anything that has to do with a slave auction is absolutely horrendous, inappropriate, and absolutely bizarre. I mean, who are we auctioning? Curriculum criteria and discussion, and it should have been something that should have been executed and before it was implemented.
Absolutely. So I think one of my first questions with this is, how do we even get to this point where I think so often in these conversations, the question becomes, how did this get approved? Or like, how did somebody not know that this was inappropriate? And we're seeing the same conversation with the teacher in the school who did the mocking indigenous dance in teaching the mathematical theorem. And, the question was presented, how did she not know better, despite the fact that this is not the first time that has been used as a lesson. In fact, it's been historically presented as the way of remembering that particular formula since at least the early 1990s. So the question doesn't seem to be, how did she not know better, but how is it just now becoming that we're calling it a problem? Dr. Allen.
Yeah, one of the things I wanted to point out is that typically when these events happen, whiteness has a way of excusing behaviors down to the individualistic level. But we're not talking about individuals. We are talking actually about the hidden curriculum in schools that suggests who is human and who is not human. Furthermore, like this teacher doing this horrific dance, right? Or even slave auctions via social media, right? And when we get into our later conversation about social media and who's allowed to make use of it in certain ways, these aren't individual acts. So for school districts to then come out after things happen and say, oh, this is not what we represent, it's absolutely what you represent. When you remove things such as critical race theory, or you wage war against it without really understanding it, when you, in the case of Portland, when you ban Black Lives Matter, right, memorabilia as political items, when you ban pride flags, what you're doing essentially is you are erasing from the conversation humans. And we see this not just with Black lives in the context of the United States, but we also see this in other media as well. And so with very light tread and feet, we saw this also with the Holocaust, and not just the Jews that were exterminated, but the 11 million other people, or the 5 million other people who were also exterminated as well. People with disabilities, LGBTQ community. This is a consistent pattern, and this is the necessity of critical race theory, because then we can start looking at it from the lens of racism. Critical race theory is really just a tool, y'all. It's a tool that allows us to examine the experiences of racialized human beings within this country, right? And so it's not a, how did we get to this point? It's more so a, this is inherent in our practices, in our structures, and the actions or the manifestation of those practices and structures is not something that really confuses people who have been historically excluded and marginalized, right? We know this is the history of this country. So we didn't just get here. We have been perfecting this for a very long time.
I agree, Dr. Allen. It speaks to the Tucson schools when they eradicated all of the historical content about the Hispanic and the Hispanics' contribution to the United States. They eradicated all of that from the school system and forbade people to teach about it, talk about it. So again, I agree with you. It piggybacks on that same concept. When people hear critical race theory, the average European, they tense up because they don't want to address what has happened to underserved populations for years in this country. They don't want to own up to what has happened, what their ancestors have done to us, because that would mean that they're admitting that they're at fault and they're not perfect. And so I agree with you. This has been going on for a long time. And in the school systems, and back in, I think it was the 80s, late 90s, it started with eradicating all historical content about what Hispanics have done for this country in Tucson. And then now it has spread to the eradication and challenging of 1619 project. And so again, I agree with you. It's not just this one situation. It has escalated to this point because it has been simmering for a long time. Thank you.
I would just like to add the contradiction that we have on two opposite ends of the country. We have a whole debate about critical race theory in the Virginia governor's race happening at the same time kids in Portland are being exposed to a slave auction, where if you taught critical race theory, neither one of those things would be happening. So if we actually examine the necessity of one, you eradicate the other. Number two, critical race theory is not something that is actually being taught in K through 12. It's being taught in colleges. So this is a false narrative. It is a completely made up story. And if anyone was quote unquote exposed to something that made them uncomfortable, they're going to have a very difficult time going to college, because that is the entire point of a higher education. So trying to make something a boogeyman when we only have to look at our own nightly news to see that things are happening on one side of the country and another side of the country, they're providing evidence as to why things are needed. There's so much confusion as to why they just simply want to erase the history of African Americans in this country. That's what it all comes down to. Every year, if you look back, every year there is a slave auction somewhere in this country. Every year there's an incident of blackface, or 2 or 3 or 10. Every year. It's almost predictable, specifically this time of year as we approach Halloween, when we all have to do our warnings, flow charts, whatever we can do to remind people what is and what is not acceptable. This is going to continue to happen as long as we do not stand up and say, this is why it is wrong. And third, we're going to have to make sure to make it relevant to them, because they have clearly distinguished that what happens to us doesn't matter. So we are going to have to make this relevant to them. We're going to have to show them their own errors, show them themselves to themselves in order for them to see it. Because just simply talking about our pain, our hurt, our trauma is not making any headway.
Oh, Kara, can I jump in here really, really quickly? Because something that Kiana said is really, really key. Without structures like, and I need everyone to understand this, there is not a structure in place. If it was not for Kimberly Crenshaw, there would not be a structure in place to be able to, one, dissect and to understand why this continues to happen. So CRT is around here telling us, y'all are shocked and you are stuck on this lone wolf, or they feared for their life. All these other false narratives that are here. But critical race theory is a tool that lets you, that allows us to dissect that and actually to pull back even further, that we can't just talk about leadership. We can't just talk about education and think that that is the normative for everyone in this country. Critical race theory says, oh, Well, great. You have this thing called education, but how is education experienced if you are a person with disability? How is education experienced if you are a Black woman or a Black girl? And then how is education experienced if you have overlapping social identities that kick you out of the norm, right? And because we understand that this country is normed on like this cis hetero white male Christian dominant filter, anything outside of that is what we call historically marginalized or historically excluded. And that should not be confused with minorities, right? Which is a way to denigrate the struggles and humans. It's another way for us to linguistically oppress other humans. So without these tools, it's important for people to understand that there is no way to make sense of it at all. So when we're asking people or we're asking school districts, how did you not know that this is not okay? I'm suggesting that because we are inherently racist in this country, our structural racism, this is not an individualistic thing. This is how we actually built a country. And that is going to permeate in our laws, in the way we make policies, and who does not get to vote, how we draw lines and boundaries, who is considered human, who is jailed for 15 years for less than a gram of weed, or if that's how you measure it, or an ounce of weed or whatever. So sorry, y'all. And who is forgiven, who gets to, and this is an actual case, sexually assault unconsenting, unconscious women and get let off by a judge because it would ruin their lives. That's an actual case in California. And who gets thrown in jail because they were stealing food, or they put down someone else's address to give their children a chance at attending a better school, right? So without critical race theory, I don't even argue anymore about the validity of it. I'm just saying you don't even have an opportunity. We would never even have the opportunity to address some of these things without a framework that allows us to teach everyone about our very complex and nuanced experience in this country.
So let me jump in here because I want to go back to your original premise, Ms. House, about the auctions and accountability. Because we talk about everything that everybody on this panel said is true, but we have to get back to holding someone accountable, because these are, as you say, we're inherently racist. Well, we don't need to have these inherently racist people, teachers, principals, administrators, to still be a part of this racist infrastructure that continues to disenfranchise our students, our kids, from the whole learning domain in the journey, which creates a deterrent for learning about the 1619 Project. These are important because these slave auctions were created by a racist, okay? And we don't talk about who created this. We have to flush these people out of the system, because right now we're losing a whole generation right now. This generation is lost in assaults. The pandemic hit, that dismantled learning. Many of them are involved in health and wellness crises, visual impairments because their eyes have gone bad looking. I was talking to parents today who were talking about how this screen, but aside from that, we need to hold people accountable for making these racist decisions, creating these racist opportunities to make our students, our minorities, our African-American girls and boys look bad in the classroom. I mean, it's just the next, the Crown Act is one thing that we need to be concerned about. That's, you can't wear braids over here. And what was it, a month ago, a white teacher cut a biracial child's hair in the classroom, cut her locks off that her parents have been growing for her for forever. And there was no accountability for it. They just slapped her on the hand and she was back in the classroom the next day. So we have to have accountability, and these people have to be exposed, and then they need to be terminated from the infrastructure, from our educational institution. I am dismayed at the way our system looks now in our schools. We have a school here in Phoenix, Arizona right now, in South Phoenix, and I won't name the school, that has had 10 to 12 fights per day this week. 2 days ago, they had the U.S. Marshals on campus. The U.S. Marshals arresting our students. Okay, so what's going on in our educational institutions? Our kids are leaving school. They're not returning. They don't have a fair chance to learn anything educationally, to learn the history, but the accountability is faltering. We're not holding these people accountable.
Dr. Peaton, I want to come to you.
Hi, thank you. I agree with everything that has been said previously, so I won't repeat it. But to focus in on the question, slave auctions and that kind of thing has been happening in our own backyard. There was an incident at a basic school in Phoenix where a teacher asked for a volunteer, and they didn't know what they were volunteering for. And one African-American male student stepped forward, and it turns out that he was going to be the subject for, I think her purpose was to show the class how racial slurs or what have you would hurt someone. So the class walked by him and said all these horrible things, and the kid was traumatized and devastated. And then also in Glendale, a teacher had a learning experience that involved the students making a board game, and the board game was to create a plantation and devise ways and means that the slaves could escape. And once again, that was traumatizing, as a student. And what's so hypocritical about this whole thing about critical race theory is that they're saying that they don't want Anglo kids to be uncomfortable. African-American kids have always been uncomfortable. I know when I was in 3rd grade, I wished the floor would open up and I could disappear every time something was mentioned about African-American history, and it was never African-American history. They would portray us as barbaric savages running naked through the jungles of Africa. And it was horribly embarrassing. And I think every generation in my family has been subjected to the same thing. But what I think is vitally necessary, and my last session in the House of Representatives, I did present a bill that would, and I was working with the African American Commission to produce a curriculum and a program where we would teach white teachers. Well, let's say we'll teach the majority of teachers how to appropriately teach African American history so that it would not traumatize students. Trying to give them the benefit of the doubt. They're trying to do something for African American history, but they don't know what to do, how to do it, or the appropriate way to present the content. So that was the purpose of that bill. Of course, it never saw daylight, but that was the intent. And I think I don't know if any of you have ever had any courses in K-12 school on African American history. I know I didn't. So, most people are not taught African American history. And I think we're going right back to 1870 when they're trying to do everything they can to erase the African descendants in this country. They don't want you to be present. They don't want you to know your history. They certainly don't want you to have any rights about anything. So we're just going backwards at a very, very, very fast pace, and it's tragic. But I think that if we start trying, teaching our own families and our own kids about our own history, and then teaching the educators. Most of the educators are white women. I think probably 80%. So if we can teach the mass majority of them the authentic, comprehensive history of this country, and that would include all of us, the good, the bad, and the ugly, and it wouldn't just cherry pick parts of the history that someone wanted to highlight. So we have a lot of learning to do. Thank you.
Thank you. As you were sharing that, it was making me think about two things. First, in just thinking back to if I ever had an African American history class, I did in high school. It was presented as an elective. The teacher was admittedly not very well versed, to the point that he frequently had to ask the Black students in class if we could share on what he was supposed to be teaching. And that burden that it put on, one of the things that I always appreciated with my mom and dad was their focus on ensuring that I knew the history that wasn't being taught in school. And what that made me think of too was, for those who may have been part of or around for the Live Black Experience community forums that we had before writing the strategic plan for the city of Flagstaff. That was one of the statements that I don't think will ever leave me, from a young girl in one of the Flagstaff schools who shared during a session focused on youth. And what she shared was herself and others having asked why they weren't being taught about Black history and why this wasn't part of the curriculum. And them being told as children within the school system that because there were only one or two of them, it wasn't necessary. I will never forget that young woman sharing that with us, because I think at the time of sharing, she might have been in her teens, but this is conversations that I'm sure were being had from the time that she was much younger. And that suggestion that because there are few, you don't matter, in a time period where we are actively talking about Black Lives Matter and denying that conversation in this country because it makes other people uncomfortable. So to not dominate the conversation, I want to go back to, two of you have talked about school fights and lack of administrative guidance and these sorts of things happening in our schools. And it made me think also of the recent story out of Louisiana, where there were growing numbers of school fights. And it was a group of Black fathers who started the organization Dads on Duty to go into the schools. And there was a pretty instant dropping of the number of fights. And I compare that to both the representation of the absentee Black father, that is the popular presentation of Black men in our communities, and paralleling that with the insistence, especially in schools that would be considered to be in urban environments or inner city schools, but throughout the country, just the insistence on policing young people with essentially what are police officers in the school, and seeing where even that is not working. There was just a recent story about a school patrol officer who dragged a young girl by her hair out of the school and placed her under arrest. So just seeing how all of these things are coming together is part of it. It's not just one conversation, it's part of a national conversation. What needs to be happening in our schools that is not happening to keep it from being the responsibility of a group of fathers to protect their children within the school system and to create this sort of environment that's conducive to learning that apparently the schools are unable to create without them getting involved? What's missing?
So this is an excellent thread of a conversation that I know is going to be had with us. Coming from a large city, Philadelphia, I went to a high school with in my graduating class, there were 1,000 seniors. There were so many students in the high school, we had to go to school in shifts. So, and that made sense. So one of the challenges here, or in most schools that are large, too many students. I mean, it's no way in the world that, as I heard one of my panelists say that, which is true, 85% of educators are white women. Okay, and who are we educating? Our minority students in most of our minority communities. And when we're not there, they are the minority, and in a white school, and they're the ones who get disenfranchised as well. So number one, I think the infrastructures of the schools need to be broken down to smaller learning communities, first and foremost. And I don't think that we should have every freshman, junior, senior, and sophomore on campus at one time. I used to work at one of the largest schools in the Phoenix Junior High School District, and we had 3,500 students on that campus from sun up to sundown. And can you imagine the problems and the things that happen in the course of a day? Those schools don't become schools anymore. They become little cities. Administrators become the police officers. And then the police become, add more aggression to the whole situation, depending on what it is. Of course, if they're brown and black students, they're going to be disciplined and consequence. And it's always usually one lone black administrator on these campuses. And we have to try to solve all the problems that no one else cares about. No one else looks like us. So the schools, too big. They truly are. We have to really divide them into smaller communities. And that's how we have to deal with students. A. B. We need more black male educators. We need especially males on our campuses. A lot of these white educators, you already know, they're graduating from these universities. And they're coming out of school and they're teaching these high school and junior high school kids, and they're showing like a 6 or 7 year age difference. And they have the little cargo pants on and flip flops and messy buns, and they're walking around like little teenagers themselves. These are who are educating our kids. And there's a different expectation for black students, male students, and black female students. So we have to look at trying to recruit teachers that really understand how to work and understand the experiences of minority students. And I'm not saying that these teachers all need to be black. They just need to have a comprehensive, inherent understanding of how to work with minority students. And that is across the board. Every student is different when it comes to how they deal with commands and instructions and directives and this, that, and the other. And they're different when they're going from a white female teacher to a black male student or a black female student. So the problems that come about in the classroom is they're too tight. The classrooms are too small. There's not enough materials. There's not enough instruction that these students feel like they're valued and that you care about them. And most importantly, they don't feel like there's anything that they are learning that relates to them. So what does that conjure up inside of you? Anxiety, frustration with everything else that they bring to the classroom. And I'm most disappointed as an educator, and I'm going to stop, is that we do not hire enough black administrators. In this state alone, we only have 3 African-American school superintendents. 3. If you know of any more than that, please apprise me. We have 3 in this entire state. We're not getting together. We're not recruiting. We have eligible candidates who are ready for superintendency, and we don't recruit them. And if we do, we don't keep them. We don't retain them. That's the sad part. Governing boards hire superintendents. Superintendents hire principals. Principals hire teachers. We need to have more black superintendents in these schools. Out of all these school districts in this state, we only have 3 black superintendents. I believe there are 2 men and 1 woman. That's sad.
That raises a really important question for me, I think, is, what leads to those numbers? Because it's always presented as though there is no one eligible or no one with the skill set to fill those positions. And yet we know that teachers are out there. We know that those with the skill set to be administrators are out there. And it's presented as though it's a problem of them not seeking the job, when the reality seems to be that they are seeking it, but they're not being recruited and they're not being offered that opportunity. So what needs to happen to create those opportunities? Dr. Peaton, I see that you're unmuted. If you were going to address something else, feel free, or if you want to take that question.
Okay, actually, to that point that you were just making, in order to recruit, retain highly qualified administrators and teachers, they need to be paid more. And that's the first step. If you expect a man of the household to support his family, with minimum wage, basically. That's not realistic, because when you know, talk to some young people who are out here in the work world right now, they laugh at you. You suggested that they became a teacher starting at what, maybe $42,000 a year, what have you. So that's one thing. We've been pushing for that too. The other thing is that, have you noticed that a lot of schools are built and they look like prisons? And I was a construction manager for a school in the Isaac School District, and I had to fight to have windows put in so natural light would come in, because it affects the mood and emotions of the people in the building. And, you know, so I did get little slivers of light, but really, you know, not a lot. So the whole environment that's created looks like a prison. And then they staff so many school resource officers that it feels like a prison. So one thing I think, our children need to be listened to, talked to, advised, counseled. So therefore, we need more counselors and we need more social workers in the schools, not more. And I do feel some schools are really rough. You know, they're all kinds of populations of students, and some schools do need SROs, and maybe, you know, one. But it certainly shouldn't be an army of SROs and no counselors and no social workers. And because the problem is, usually the encountering a SRO in a school will be the direct entrance for that student into the prison to school, of the school to prison pipeline. So and because when the SRO gets involved, they have to charge the students. I mean, there's a whole bureaucratic procedure that they have to do. And that really creates the problem. That starts funneling our children into prisons. And so therefore, we do need more counselors and social workers and fewer SROs. And one of the problems too is a lot of teachers, you know, we have over 2,000 teachers teaching now in this state who are not certified. They're not highly qualified teachers. They basically are babysitters. So they have no idea how to manage a class. And teachers get, you know, they don't know how to address incorrigible students. And what they do, the first thing they do, they'll call the principal or they'll call the SRO to come in. So the teacher is not managing the class. And the kids know that. They know that that is a weak teacher. She has no power. So of course she or he gets tested every day. And it just, I mean, the number of discipline referrals just keeps racking up. And to that end, we also need a community developed progressive discipline policy, you know, so that the student, the teacher, the parents, everyone knows, if you do this one time, this is going to happen. If you do it again, that's going to happen. If you do it again, whatever. And then there should be some sort of intervention to help stop these types of behaviors. But we're not putting, education is not a number one priority in Arizona. It's incarceration. So that's why we see our students being stuffed into the pipeline to prison. And we really need to work on stopping that.
I want to address the issue of why don't we have more African-American administrators, educators. Let's look at the hiring committees. So Dr. Hart, I also hail from Philadelphia. And why am I in Arizona? Because when I applied to teach on the East Coast, I was met with a panel of all white women. So again, if you want to hire your own, how do we get our own on those hiring committees? So when I arrived here at NAU, I joined several hiring committees for different faculty, staff, because I'm diverse and they needed a diverse body. And one of the first acts I did was make sure that there was some brown person applying. And if they were applying and they were qualified, they got my vote. And I know one person I know was hired because of my influence. And so I say this to say, we need administrators in higher positions on committees to hire other brown administrators and educators. You say there are only 3 black superintendents in the state of Arizona. Well, who hired them? Are these brown people hiring them, or are they white people hiring them? So we got to look at the source. And so not to say that they're not qualified, not to take anything away from Dr. Payton saying that the money is not, their bag is not accurate. Okay, they don't have that correct salary. when someone wants to teach, be they brown or black, they will travel 3,000 miles like I did, take a salary pay cut to get that experience to teach. But we need someone on those committees to give us a chance to hire us. And more often than not, they don't look like us. Thank you.
So that infrastructure, you're absolutely correct. For instance, the Latinos, they have their own conglomerate where they recruit, and they have them their own symposium, if lost of better words, if you will. So when there is a Latino superintendent or a superintendent's opening, they come straight from that conglomerate. We have to establish the same kind of thing, a superintendent's academy for African Americans. We used to have it years ago when I first came here, but we've never, as I've been here 41 years, Dr. Moore, there have never been more than 5 African American superintendents of any K through 12 school, ever, because I used to do the statistics on it. I used to present this nationally. How do we recruit? We don't have a superintendent's academy. We've had people who have superintendent's credentials and they're not used, but we have to develop our own academy. So when there is an opening, we recruit from that. And we not only recruit them, we get them into the job, we support them, we mentor them, and we let them know we are your strength, your backbone. Until that happens, we're never going to have any conversation at the table that has any teeth on it. And it's a shame here in 2021 that we have 3 Black superintendents. We used to have 4. Until August the 31st of this year, and she passed. And I was her replacement before she passed, because she got sick, and I was the acting superintendent to close her school year out. And months later, she passed. And that's ridiculous. That's ridiculous. But you're absolutely correct. So I look at us as our African American community. What are we going to do? Just like these issues we're talking about at these schools. I had a principal that called me today and said, "Well, Dr. Hart, what do you think we should do?" The parents. The students are at this, but the parents have to be held responsible. Dr. Peaton, you know that, right? The parents have to be responsible. We can't always speak on behalf of students. The parents have to, when you talk to parents at the restaurant and in the community, at the park, and on the telephone, you encourage them, you tell them what to do, you give them the information, you even give them the ARS statute that they can use. Come to the board meetings and be heard. What happens? They don't show up at the board meetings, and if they show up, they don't speak. That's the only time things are going to be exposed, at governing board meetings. And parents have to be more involved and advocate on behalf of their children. They have to do that.
Okay. I'm going to actually disagree on some of these things. I think we've talked about a lot of stuff that I can't even touch. But one of the things I do want to insert here, because this is my research, is that African American parents are extremely involved in their students' education, probably not in ways that are normed, right? So serving on boards and coming in to donate snacks, right? Especially if you belong to a social economic strata that means you have to work. One of the most valuable things that working class parents or parents who have to work to provide for their children have is time. So when we say at schools, we want parents to come in and be involved, what we're really saying is we want you to be involved in ways that we approve, right? So that's the first thing that I would say. The second thing I would say is this, because I think this conversation started off with Black fathers and this myth of Black fathers not being involved in their children's lives. Well, the CDC tells us that that's not true at all. What it is that they are not, the structures of their involvement do not look the same as the nuclear family, right? Which is normed on that 1950s stay home white family. Black fathers are extremely involved. And everything from I go to work to pay the light bill so that you will have lights so that you can do homework, to I'm picking you up to make sure that you have these things. So I just want to address that Black parents, whether it's mom, dad, or non-binary, are extremely engaged, right? And they're actually the ones who are going into schools that are teaching teachers how to handle, how to care for, and how to teach their children. But if you are a working class parent and we say, you got to get more involved, right? Well, they are involved, but what do you want them to do when they come in? This is the question that I would pose. The second thing that I want to say is, like, when it comes to like hiring committees, is why aren't we starting with the knowledge production that our children come to school with? Even if you had a parent come in and teach drumming or some form or some entrepreneurship, whatever it is that they do, we know that successful schools that teach Black children, there are lots of parents, lots of adults, I'll say adults involved, right? And this is Gloria Ladson Billings' work of the Dream Keepers, that each of these, in these schools that are like 90, 90, 90, so 90% free and reduced lunch, 90% students of color, and then 90% of students can read, right, on grade level. The distinguishing factor is that every adult, whether it's the janitor or the parents or the teachers, are teaching something. And so our students have more contact with adults. And this is a very Afrocentric rooted practice, right? So I don't want us to just have more parents or more Black educators. All that's great. But what happens when the Black educator has a level of white supremacy that they have internalized and then they're teaching your student? What happens when we have superintendents or teachers or counselors, right? So I also want us to be discerning in that as well, that representation is such a low bar. It's like, what do we do once you are in there? How are you ensuring, what are the practices that you're putting into place? And that's a little bit divergent, I understand, from the brilliant women and respectfully the aunties on this board. But I also know, as a parent who was a grassroots organizer of other parents who were teaching them how to send the one sentence email introductions or setting intentions for their child. Hey, my name is Tria Allen. Jez and Jay and Mirabelle are my children. This is what I expect because this is where they want to go. Here's my contact information. Please let me know. Oftentimes when I went into schools as a parent who was very confident in the future I saw for my children, I was isolated, right? Labeled a problem parent. She's high maintenance, or we don't mess with Tria's kids because we don't want to deal with her. And that was from a Black administrator. So beyond just having representation, I also want to make sure that the person coming in, and I think this is implied, so that's not what I'm saying, what you're saying, but I also want to make sure that this person also sees the brilliance in our children, that are not making judgment calls. You know, as a professor in higher ed, I had the privilege of having a Black mother group. I never got with them. Like I never took a class with them, but they were there. And that made all the difference in teaching me how to navigate being a first generation grad student, a first generation student, and even a first generation doc student. But even more so than that, when we talk about representation, how are we training those who are in place? What does the continued education look like? And I think this idea of having this leadership group, and I do know that there's a couple of them here, but not specifically for education, is super important, because when these K through 12 kids get to high school or get to college, we do a lot of work of helping them to unlearn and to deal with the educational trauma so they can just sit in classrooms and perform. And a lot of times that looks like Saturday mornings with Dr. Allen, Teas and Zooms, and all of these other things. So I also want to bring that out as well, that it's not just representation, we have to go beyond that.
If I could just bring up one point, I think I'm might be the only one right now that has school-age children. I have a high school junior and a high school senior, and one that's already out of high school. I also recognize the privilege that I have as a college graduate of young Black children in the school system, and learning how to advocate for myself and for my children on day one. Not everyone has that. Not everyone that is advocating for their kids knows how to do it, knows exactly what to say. Also, I have the privilege of working in politics and having direct relationships with people on my children's governing board. Not everyone has that. So where we have privilege, we have to use it for our own children, and making sure that the access that we have to things, even within our own communities, as we are, the little bit of privilege we have, we are highly educated women, and we have to share that knowledge that we have with those individuals who don't know how to advocate, because they will look at any and all of us and make assumptions about us. And I've actually seen the change. I've seen the click happen in my students, in my children's teachers, once they meet you on parent teacher night, which I never miss, because I want to introduce myself and my credentials so that they understand on day one who they are dealing with. And I have yet to have that many problems because of that. As well as I just, interestingly enough, found out that one of my children's teachers was Googling parents to find out what their parents did. I don't even know if that's allowable. Well, interestingly enough, I'm very Googleable. And that meant that it changed the attitude that they had towards my child in a positive way, and made them more amenable to ingratiating themselves to my child, just simply because they understood who their parent was. Where we have privilege, we have to use it not only for ourselves and our children, but for the collective of our children.
Thank you all. We are almost at an hour into our session, so I want to move to a second topic, which I think is very timely as well, and very important, and probably equally as difficult, and that is the Rittenhouse trial. As we were preparing to come into this session, it was actually one of the panelists who brought this up as something that we need to talk about right now. For those who may not be aware, currently Kyle Rittenhouse is on trial for having shot and murdered 2 protesters during the protests following the police shooting of Jacob Blake in August of 2020. It was recently declared by the judge in that case that while attorneys could refer to those who were shot as rioters or looters, among other terms, the attorney should not use the word victim in referring to them. And what he said was that the word victim is a loaded word. I think alleged victim is a cousin to it. He very strongly disagreed when it was pointed out that terms like rioters and looters or terrorists or other terms like that are equally loaded. He disagreed. So let's dive in and talk about that. What is going on in this case, and what does it tell us about where we are right now as a country when it comes to some of the continued conversations in the racial reckoning that the country is going through? What does it say in terms of accountability when it comes to the way we view? Kyle Rittenhouse is one who we also know had thousands, if not millions of dollars raised for him by different groups defending his actions in killing those people. So how do we respond to that? How do we view this trial right now?
Racist, white supremacy at its best. Okay, number one, we shot both of these victims walking down the street with a AK-15. He was offered water and was patted on the head and asked that he needed a private escort to wherever he was going. Now imagine if that was a Black man or woman walking down the street with an AK-15. They would have been shot in the head. Okay, number one, this is white supremacy at its best. And this is a preview of saying that he will not serve any time. He'll be let off on probation or he'll get very little time. How in the world can you call these people terrorists? That was just like Dylan Roof in South Carolina when he killed the preacher and the 9 parishioners and they took him to Burger King. Really? So there's only one way to view this. And this is the culture and the pipeline to which way this country is going, with the voter suppression, with the Republicans denying every economic piece of revenue that needs to go to housing and medical care and education and criminal justice reform and et cetera, et cetera. So there's only one word for it in my mind: racism.
I think we have to look at this the way that we look at all things. We know that the system, the justice system in America, was one not created for us, but created to subject us to it. So we already know that fairness in the justice system is basically by luck and prayer when it comes to African Americans in that system, and how we are treated, one as victims or as, alleged perpetrators in that system. I think, without being an attorney, I think this will all be appealed. I think it will go up and up and up, and it will be appealed, and it's a bad ruling. There's entirely too much precedent as to other people in other areas and other spaces with other crimes being called a victim for it to not be utilized in this case. So without any legal degree, I think it will be appealed. It's just to whom? Because we know that if it moves up, at some point we get into appointments of judges that were not done by the current administration, but were done by the previous administration, which we then run up against a whole new set of challenges then. But I think we just have to view this system and continue to shine a light on things like this that happen, which is why the press, which is why journalists need to be deeply involved in our justice system and reporting on it, because otherwise we would not know. So we need the light shining on these cases wherever they are, however small they are, whether it's a kid being accused falsely of shoplifting on one side of the country, or it's a major incident or situation like this in another. We will not know unless we allow the press the freedom to report and shine a light on these things.
I concur with my colleagues on the panel. It goes back to what Coates has said about the Black body, how police can take that Black body, treat it like an animal, claim it as their own. The judge in this case is ensuring that the victims are not viewed as human beings. Because why? They were African American, more than likely, and he feels as though they don't matter. Again, that narrative, the Black lives don't matter. This echoes that sentiment that Dr. Allen talked about, Dr. Hart talked about, the hegemonic, patriarchal, white supremacy reigning supreme. And I feel that it's a disgrace and a dishonor to the victims who have lost their lives innocently because this vigilante felt that he had the right to kill innocent people. And again, I agree with Attorney Dickinson that yes, he will get off. Like you said earlier, he was hailed. They gave him donuts, cookies. He had an entire GoFundMe account to support his defense, because there are people in these United KKK states of America who feel that they have the right to claim the Black body, and that needs to stop. Thank you.
And to that point, I agree with everything that has been said. But don't you all feel that this is history repeating itself? It has repeated itself since 1619. And at this point, I think many of us are almost desensitized. It's like this is the norm. This is what happens. But I agree with Kiana. We need to, in spite of the fact that is the norm, we still need to keep fighting. We need to highlight it. We need to protest. We need to let people know that this isn't right and we're not accepting it. So, but that's a whole nother mission. But we can't give up. And we all know that this country has two systems of justice. one that's Black and one that's white. And I think that's part of the talk that we give our children. I know I have 2 sons, 4 grandsons, and I've given them all that talk. You will not be judged fair and equitable if you're caught doing anything wrong. So don't do it. So thank you.
I want to talk about that because I've been parts of several conversations recently with folks who see a statement like that you just made, Dr. Peaton, as are we setting our children up to fail by telling them that they are being treated differently and not seeing where some of that history comes from. And part of the conversation has also been the pushback on the idea of America as a white supremacist or racist nation. And those who say it's not, and I don't have a racist bone in my body, and those sorts of statements. And the interesting comment that I heard recently in pushing back on that was saying, that's like living in a toxic wasteland and saying, like, well, the air might be toxic, but I have never breathed it, so it's not part of me. Like, the reality is that if we are acknowledging the history of this country and acknowledging that we're all built up in breathing that toxic air, then it is part of us as a nation. And the only way to really address it is to confront it and purge it from our systems. But that requires that acknowledgement. So I'm curious for each of you on the panel, how do you view having that conversation or having this conversation about the Rittenhouse trial, all the other things that we have talked about and will talk about tonight in confronting that legacy of America?
I've taught that to my sons so that I could keep them alive. I wanted them to be alive, to be able to grow. There's a book actually that says, kill them while they're young. And I did not want to see that happen to my sons or anyone. And when we relocated here to Arizona from New Jersey about 29 years ago, and this is one of the most concentrated racist states I've ever lived in. I've only lived in a couple, but and this kid, who is now much older, has his own family, he gets stopped about 20 times a year from racial profiling. And I am blessed that each time he has stopped, he has been able to come out of it alive. And that's only because he knows how to act, what to say, how to say it. And you can call it whatever you want, but if it keeps them alive, because my talk to my sons was, if you are confronted with the police or some manner of authority, your job is to be respectful and get home alive. If you get home alive, we as your parents can get lawyers and go fight your battle, but you cannot fight your battle there alone. You have to get out of that situation and get home alive. And and they see it. I mean, they actually see, especially living here in Arizona, they see how their white friends are treated, and they see how they are treated, and they see a difference. And it's not fair and equitable, and that we recognize that. But I don't think we can totally give up the fight, but we just have to be realistic and know that, yeah, we do live in a toxic, hostile environment. And it has detrimental effect on our physical, emotional, and psychological health. But we survive.
Dr. Allen, I saw you had unmuted.
I actually want to take just a small step back, because we know that Dr. Barbara J. Love, she has this article called Developing a Liberatory Consciousness. And one of her premises, or one of their premises, is this, that we are all a part of a system that teaches us how to think, how to act. And we all play a part in that system, whether it advantages us or disadvantages us. This is the process called socialization, right? And so regardless of if I appear to be a historically marginalized or historically excluded person, right, in this country, I know that I constantly have to check myself because of what my very good sis, Kiana Dickinson, just said, is that we also have to mind the privileges that we have as well, right? So I understand sitting here that in this privilege of having the terminal degree in my field, that my voice is probably going to be honored and heard more so than someone else's voice, even if that experience is not one that I share. Right. And so I have to constantly interrupt, right? This is the perniciousness of and the subtlety of socialization. We will be walking around here thinking that an idea is ours, and we have been socialized to think that way. And it starts even before we come out of our out of the womb, right? Is we're taught what is good, what is bad, what is acceptable. Girls do this, boys do this. Girls are automatically referred to like this. This is where they belong. This is what Black women do. Here are the tropes of Black womanhood. And so I'm constantly having to interrupt and disrupt that, one, in myself, like first, because that message comes to me first, before I even like try and pick out the beam in my brother or sister colleague's eye. I also have to understand and to do some examination myself. Like, are you speaking from a place of privilege? Is this really what you think? Whose knowledge are you privileging? Whose opinion are you privileging? And so this is the part where Dr. Tracy was talking about, Dr. Tam, was talking about, so ingrained to me, Dr. Tam, did you see me like freeze up for a minute? This is the part where Dr. Moore was talking about, is that yes, the Black body is not, it's not valued, but at the same time, what happens if you're light skinned? What happens if your family has more money? What happens if you are second, third, fourth generation college born? What happens if you have finances? And all of these things are constantly things that I'm constantly thinking about, especially as I'm thinking about my own college kids who have a Dr. Allen as a mom who can show up in certain ways. And so I think this idea of socialization, regardless of your color, I can still be very much problematic, even in this skin, even with these social, identities that I hold. And I think this is a necessity of having a sister circle or people who can disrupt that, people who can pull your coat or pull you back and say, hey, remember that time when you had red flags and we worked with you to get rid of those red flags? I think this is the necessity of, like I talked about, my mother's circle being Dr. Allen, one of the people who is here in this conversation tonight, who pulled me back and was like, this what we doing? Is this what we invested in? Right? To check us constantly. And so that's what I would say. We are all victims, right? Or participants in socialization.
Speaking to the different systems that exist for different groups, I think we can also wrap in two of the other topics that we had for tonight, which is a case in September of this year where a Black family was told by police that they could not act on neighbors who were blasting racial slurs. They were playing slurs and monkey noises at volume to intentionally disturb the peaceful enjoyment of their Black neighbors, of their community and their home. And police told them that it was not actionable because the activity was not considered criminally actionable. At the same time, I'd pull into that the conversation around social media that's happening right now, with the pull of people away from different social media platforms because of the impacts on certain groups of people. But what stands out particularly as the overlooked or missed or ignored part of the conversation with social media platforms is the inequitable application of community standard policies, where the frequency with which complaints of racial harassment, threats of racial violence, or racist remarks are not deemed worthy of being removed because they're not seen as violations of those community policies. So it seems to reflect an imbalanced system at the very least, if not completely separate rules that are set up based on the color of our skin. So I'd love us to delve into that a little bit and talk about why these two different systems exist, and how we go about seeking justice in a system that denies it because wrongs against us are not deemed criminal.
I will just say, when it comes to social media is still the old Wild West. It is a frontier that has yet to be governed, yet to be fully understood, and yet to even find some self-awareness as to what it is and what it means. We know for sure that it is profitable. That we know. We know Mark Zuckerberg is a bajillionaire for a reason. What we have not figured out is, where do we exist in a platform where nothing actually exists? It's an existential question that we have not yet figured out. And I'm not sure if we're going to figure it out soon. Is it a platform for freedom of speech? Is it a creative platform? Is it a social, financial exchange? And when we deal with politics, it was the driver of, and some people would say the initiator of, the attacks on our democracy, definitely the attacks on our politics and our persons. And yet we don't have any laws on the books. So as long as we look at our laws, we have laws that are centuries old, but we have no laws, very few, maybe, less than a couple handfuls, that govern this big amorphous thing that is called social media, because we don't understand it. We just use it. And when we have new technologies, and there will be a whole nother set of technologies that come after this, that by the time we catch up to that thing, there's already a new thing there. So our policies and our laws and our ways of creating a space for justice are going to have to be our own, until the world catches up with where technology is. We're going to have to curate our social media in a way that we remove as many harmful things from our own site. We're going to have to curate it so we remove things from our children's view. We're going to have to do that for ourselves, because it is going to take a very long time for government to even figure out what social media is in a way to govern it, and then create a justice system around it.
Anyone else thoughts here, or else we can move on to our last topic, which is going to take some talking about.
I think that people hide behind social media. They tend to have a lot to say when they have an avatar as their voice or a meme as their voice. And when they are confronted in person, face to face, sometimes they are not as vocal, and the context, the narrative changes. So I concur that we do need to police it more in our own houses, and make sure our children are policed as well, because if not, they can become victimized by that same social media. We know that most young people, Generation Z, have no point of reference when it comes to having a conversation with someone face to face. They have a lot to say via text message. They can email, they can, Facebook, Snapchat, Twitter, Instagram, all day, all night. However, if you challenge them to have an actual conversation, they're speechless. So again, I feel that they hide, some of these extremists, these terrorists, these social media terrorists, I'm going to call them. They hide behind memes, they hide behind these avatars and pictures, but they don't actually have any type of backbone when it comes to being in person and challenging the status quo face to face. Thank you.
Thank you.
Can I just also add that I believe it was last week or a couple of weeks ago, Facebook, WhatsApp, Instagram go down, and they go down hard. And then we have the whistleblower who says something like, actually, without the avarice, without the malice and the maliciousness, like Facebook does not exist, or these platforms don't exist. And I think to Kiana's point, is that we really have to interrogate these structures, especially when we start looking at the documentaries like Coded Bias, because technology is not racist, but because technology touches human hands, it becomes tools of oppression, right? And we see that even now, where we have the biased community standards as it relates to what is considered hate speech and what is not. I think one of the most brilliant stands that we've seen taken in terms of like social justice and civil rights as it relates to social media is when Black content creators, Black women content creators decidedly say, we will no longer support your platform and create things for you to steal. And y'all, like the hilarity that ensued about people not being able to originally come up with dances or content. And so really what we found out is, oh, Instagram, TikTok, Facebook, I don't even know if young people use Facebook anymore, but none of these platform medias do not work without the creative genius of Black people, but they continuously are sites of trauma and harm because we will not address them or police them or provide, the same structures as we would someone who like just basically drove a car into a crowd full of people. So I think that's very, very interesting when we look at it that way, what we will and will not do with social media.
Thank you. Dr. Hart?
You kind of started this off a little differently, and but it's a mask. Social media is a mask that people wear to present something arbitrary to what they represent holistically and in a way. It's, we use it in different means to promote an outcome that we seek. And when it becomes disadvantageous to others and harmful and abhorrent and all those kind of things, then it raises a flag. I think that we should utilize it in more of an effective manner. And my message is how to challenge others to use social media for more important things, such as recruiting for jobs, employment, economics, investment opportunities, and things that can enrich us and mobilize us as a community and as a race of people who are struggling under all the suppression and oppression and racism that we're suffering today. Because we need to flip the script on Mark and Twitter. I don't even use Twitter anymore. Twitter is ridiculous. It's just like you're having a conversation with people you don't even know. Really? For what reason? Stars, athletes, politicians, they don't know you from a Kansas win paint. I think we should use it to our benefit, that we can become more educated, more mobilized through the things we're lacking right now. Because in 1 year from today, especially in the next 4 months, by 2021 and 2022 election, we are going to have, I hope that it's not this, but it's looking very grim for us. And if we don't learn now how to use social media to our benefit, to empower, to initiate, encourage, and educate, we're going to be, we're having this conversation today, the kitchen table talk, whatever it's about, and all of us are collaborating and talking and being philosophical and intelligent in education. I want to go out here and do something that's going to help us become a force that we can be successful in and united and win, so we don't have our liberties and our personal privileges, as you all use so much tonight, stripped away from us, because that's what I see coming down the pipe. So I would like to turn the social media conversation, educating our youth, our students, to stop worrying about who ate at a barbecue last week and who got a job assignment over here and who had a new outfit, new shoes, and got married and got engaged. This is not getting us anywhere.
Well, speaking of being informed, I want to close us out with, and I hope folks have time to stick with us a little bit longer, just so we can talk about what I would call the crisis at the border. So often we are talking about the crisis at the border in terms of immigration and illegal immigrations and building the wall and all of those sorts of things. But the real crisis at the border that we can talk about tonight is the crisis of the treatment of Haitians seeking sanctuary and seeking asylum in the United States, who were not only turned away, but were chased down with horses, whipped, in images that were, if not directly parallel to images of plantations and the enslavement of Black people historically, were very similar. And that became a conversation that has strangely faded into the background, despite it not being a resolved matter. So my question is just, what say each of you again to that crisis? What's happening in that situation? What does our audience need to be aware of the realities of that situation?
I will just say that a couple things. I will slightly disagree with you, Kara, because I think the matter is resolved. It's resolved as all issues of immigration are, is just to simply mistreat people and then send them back to where they come from. So the what we have to do, and if spare me a minute to be extra political, is that we're going to have to put people in office who are committed to changing immigration policy. Not just talking about immigration policy, but changing immigration policy. Put people there who are going to appoint Homeland Security individuals who are going to invest in the humanitarian treatment of individuals seeking asylum or just a better life in the United States. It all comes down to a vote. There's a vote for the type of treatment that we want of individuals. I know that seeing Haitian immigrants being treated that way just tears at our heart, but all immigrants need to be treated well when they are seeking refuge here in this United States. And to think that this happened directly after, without creating a competitiveness or a comparison to Afghanistan refugees being here, it's a contradiction that illuminates for us and makes us see the differences in how transactional our lives and our existence have to be. We have to prove our worth through our service in order to be qualified to be here as a refugee or an asylum seeker. You can't just do what is on the Statue of Liberty and say, give us a tired or hungry. That's out. They probably should just get rid of that because that no longer applies. We actually need to look at the humanitarian treatment of individuals seeking asylum in the United States, and then also how we provide aid to other countries, because the sadder part for me is that all of the things that are happening in Haiti with earthquakes and hurricanes and civil war that's happening there, we have gone into other countries for less, but we have not gone to protect this country, one of this hemisphere's oldest civilizations, and actually worked with that community, because there is no transactional value for us, and that is a shame.
If I could just add, the Black body is a burden until it's profitable. So we know that we become a country because of the Black bodies positioned in Haiti during the Revolutionary War, right? And I also want to say that the border is horrific. These images are horrific. But even before the border, the way that we treat undocumented DACA migrants, right, who do not have positionality in this country as it relates to citizenship, we see it because of our positionality and location at the border as a Mexican issue or Latino issue or Latinx issue. But what we do know in terms of like deportations and inhumane deportations, we know there's data that suggests that Black bodies lead that. So even as we're talking about seeking asylum and we're talking about immigration reform, I want to amplify what Kiana is saying, is that this is not just a Mexican issue because we're located here in Southern Arizona. It's very much a Black issue as well. Because when is the last time we were mass deporting Eurasian folks, Canadian folks? When was the last time we were at the Canadian border threatening to build a wall? Right. And so even the way we talked about language in the Rittenhouse case, I also want to just bring that back here. Like, so I believe in a lot of the articles that first came out, we weren't calling them Haitians. We were calling them illegal immigrants, which automatically positions them as less than human. Right. And so that is going to take, and actually, I don't want immigration reform. I want us to implode the system and let's start all over again. We have this wonderful narrative in this country about how we are a country of immigrants. And it is because of those immigrants and the united stuff and a melting pot of all these cultures that we are strong. That's not true. That's not true at all. Our country was built by the free and forced labor of Black folks from Africa, the African diaspora, and Black people indigenous to this country. The reason why we are a country is because of Black bodies that were leveraged by the French to then help pay and support the Revolutionary War, or the Revolutionary War that made us a republic. So this is not a, oh, I hate to be political. It has always been a political issue. Always been a political issue. And this is the necessity of voting, of putting people in place who understand this, more so than just being like, oh, that's not my issue. That's a Mexican thing. That's a Latinx thing or Latino thing. And I'm not that. It's a human thing. A human thing that also affects Black people as well, and Black bodies.
Dr. Hart?
I think it's really a sad narrative that a Black skin represents that I'm anything to you. Because when you see someone run on horseback with a whip and doesn't think twice about it, that same action wouldn't have been used toward any other race. I've never seen it. Okay, years ago, when you had the Cubans that were immigrating to Miami on boats and buckets and everything that would float, they were welcomed. And to see dark skin and what it means to the average person, whether you are securing the border, that was a scene out of 12 Years a Slave and anything else that mirrored that. And I think that the media should do a better job in how they report information and how they show it, because personally speaking, that was outrageous to even have that, depicted in that true manner that it was. And there was, of course you had the MSNBC commentaries with our Black commentators, Joy Reid, Jonathan Capehart, and Don Lemon, and maybe a few others who joined ranks with them in that conversation. But it's a shame that what our Black skin means to others who don't consider us human. And I would hope that we would have some international policies that would have some infrastructures in place, because it's just random. We don't have anything that's solid that has any has a set policy of what happens when the border is compromised. But the piece that I think is something that we should be more concerned about is that everyone going on in Haiti, okay, with the assassination of the president, Haiti became completely dismantled. I mean, there is still a government there, but this Haiti is controlled by radicals and gangs. They knew that this was going to come to this. There was no preparation. There was nothing in place. There was no strategy, no logistics. This wasn't something that just brought America by surprise. They knew what was going to happen there, and there was no plan for it. And that should not have been been the case, and I don't know who dropped the ball on that, but I do know that there's an infrastructure that needs to be corrected, because this is going to happen again. And it won't be the Haitians next time. It'll be in other indigenous groups. And America only can have, I mean, our population is already at its peak, and we have so many challenges right now. And it needs to be something that's going to secure the border in a proper, humane manner without waiting to the last minute and allowing people, because who's holding those people accountable for whipping the Haitians? It was just yesterday's news, and it's recorded, and we just shake our heads and say, too bad, so sad, get glad. You know, that's the piece that I still talk about, accountability. And politics is not addressing it. Legislation isn't holding anybody responsible. And our states and our state governments and our border security people, they're only doing what they're allowed to get away with. That's my piece on that.
I think it takes us right back to our original conversation. Nothing's being done because it fits the narrative of what has been historically precedent in this entire United States of America. We have critical race theory that's being taught only in law school. We don't want to address racism as it is, not we on this call, but we as a country. We don't want to address it because we don't want to admit that it even occurred or it happened. So here we have a cyclic conversation, a cyclic occurrence, history repeating itself over and over and over again. So yes, we have flashbacks from slavery, the plantation, with the man on the horse with his whip, beating someone running across the plantation. I felt empathy and sympathy for the people of Haiti. I have relatives who are Haitian. I felt that could have been one of my people, your people, coming across trying to seek asylum. And you have the white men in their robes, the Supreme Court and all these justices sitting back saying, oh, you know what? That's not our problem. I agree with you, Dr. Allen. It is our problem, but they don't want to admit it is our problem because they don't identify with the Black body. Again, it goes back to, we don't admit that racism occurred. We don't admit that we have any type of problems in the United States of America. So therefore, that's not our problem, but it is our problem. I agree with you. And I feel that something should be done. But again, it won't be addressed because the powers that be want to remain in power and control, and they don't want to admit that A, we have a racism problem in America, B, we need to address it, C, more importantly, these are human beings. They see the dark skin and they don't consider it to be humane. Again, with the Cubans, I agree with you. Years ago, we had Dominicans coming across here, right? In the United States. And no problem with the Dominicans, no problem with the Cubans because their complexion fit the profile. Their complexion fit the European concept of what is acceptable. But as soon as you have someone who looks African, darker skin, who's seeking asylum because they want a life, a better life for themselves, all of a sudden, they can't come across the border. No, you're not allowed in this country. Oh, we're going to get you to Mexico and then we're going to send you right back. So it's a cyclic history repeating itself over and over and over again. And unfortunately, I agree with Councilor Dickinson. It has to be a political change. Something's got to happen because if not, we're going to have this occur again and again and again. Thank you.
Can I just add one more thing? This is me being real petty right now. I'm gonna just go back to our history. You know, we are talking about these communities in like media, like, oh, clickbait, look what's happening. But I've watched two things happen in media. One, we completely disregard the actions of the United States government in purposely destabilizing countries like Haiti, right? And the investment in that, right? So that's comparative politics 101 for y'all who are listening out here. So please go research that. But the second thing that's very interesting in this case is how then we want to parcel, well, it's a split rein versus a whip. Right. So this conversation about, hey, don't get so upset. That's not what they're doing. And so it's almost like when we see someone who is publicly executed, like the videos are not saving us. So my challenge is this. The videos, the documentation is necessary, but it's not saving us. So what can we do? And I want to say that one of the things is, one, we can read about our history. The Haitian problem, the Palestinian problem, the Yemen problem, these are all Black problems, all of them, every last one of them. You know, the Kingian philosophy says that an injustice anywhere or to anyone is all of our problems because we are connected, right? And so the other part is if you do not understand these issues, here is my plea. Y'all go to a library, get on Google, contact one of us, contact the Live Black Experience, because the one thing I don't want us to walk away from is feeling like we can't affect change. That one vote thing is powerful, even though they are actively working to marginalize it and to take it away. That one vote may seem insignificant, but one vote, when I talk to my people, Dr. Moore talks to her people, Kiana Dickerson is out here educating us about like what this actually means, creates a wave of action that allows us to then go to our representatives and say, we're not going to take this. Not only are we not going to take this, we used to say in K through 12, the kids vote with their feet, right? If I don't want to be there, if it's not safe, I'm out. And I feel like I want to say that's the same way we can do here by reading, by even looking at, you know, videos, you know, even when we talk about the destabilization of Haiti, you know, Haiti decides we will not be slaves. And, you know, we have the 10-year Haitian Revolution, which is revolutionary when we think about Black bodies saying, no, we're not going to be enslaved, right? And so they rise up against the French and they're like, we will fight you every single day until we have our freedom, right? Because the Quran and even the Holy Bible say that the natural state of man is freedom, right? And we have been making Haiti pay globally since that day, which is like 1790s, right? Till now. That's crazy when you think about it. That is wild when you think about it. And so I invite all of us out here, like as a community of humans, just to learn more about it and to get involved where you can, even if it's teaching about Haiti across your dinner table.
Well, over on the other side of the mountain is Dominican and Republican. It's the caste system. That's what you're talking about. Because Haiti is totally, you know, the color of the skin is the color of my shirt. That's what it's the racist, you know, the ideologies and all that. Yes. But the bottom line, they are Black and they don't want to be dealt with in a positive, humane manner. Because right across the other side of that mountain, the Dominicans, and some of them are lighter than any of us on this panel, and they're Black. They're darker than some of us, and they consider themselves white. Across Americas by Lewis Henry Gates. Read that.
Well, I want to thank you all for participating in this conversation. We're at the end of our time, but we are certainly not at the end of the conversation. There is so much more that could have been said on each topic that we touched on tonight, and so much more that could be said for all of what's happening right now in Black America in general, and in so many different topics that are touching on our lives and our lived experiences. As always, we say thank you to our audience members who joined and participated tonight. We always want to remind and encourage you to keep coming out and participating in these conversations. Our next one is on Wednesday, November 3rd, on the color of Hollywood or lack thereof, examining the issue of colorism in Hollywood. And we look forward to that conversation as we look forward to all of our conversations. To each of the panelists from tonight, I say thank you, absolutely thank you for bringing the truth, bringing your truths, bringing your lived experiences, your knowledge, your wisdom, and just facing these topics head on and bringing this conversation forward. To everyone else out there tonight, I again say thank you. And as we always say, be blessed and go in grace.
Take care. Good night, everybody.